Welcome back to our conference From Quarries to ROCKCUT Sites, Echoes of Stone Crafting. We move on to our final panel of this second day of our conference. Just to remind you, I am Katie Whitaker, the conference chair, and we're going to have three speakers this afternoon, and I'm also joined by one of the conference organisers, Claudia Sciutto. So I'm just going to remind our next three speakers, they have 15 minutes for their presentations. If necessary, I will ring the bell at 13 minutes with a 2-minute reminder. And then at 15 minutes at the end, please conclude and draw your presentation to a close. But as I've said, I'll try not to interrupt if it looks like the timing is working. After each presentation, we have a few minutes possibly for one question, but we have, of course, our discussion session following the panel of three papers. So hopefully, probably that's when we'll hold most of the questions for. We're going to begin this afternoon with a presentation from Paul PEIGNOT of the Université Paris-Panthéon-Sorbonne. His paper is titled "The Alleged Pre-Nabataean Chambers at Hegra." Paul, it's lovely to see you. Thank you for joining us, for being here this afternoon. We're looking forward to your presentation. So if you can share your screen, we'll give you a moment to do the technical thing. Perfect, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Katie. So hello everybody, and thank you to the organizers of this conference to offering me the possibility to be part of it. I'm Paul PEIGNOT, and I'm gonna talk about rock-cut tombs of the Alula region of Saudi Arabia, and more precisely the tombs from two sites, the ancient Dadan and Hegra, located at the northwest of the country. Sorry. The region of Alula is characterized by the presence of sandstone outcrops, punctuating the lowland filled with sand. Here is a view of the landscape of Madain Saleh, with the outcrops surrounded by sand and some vegetation. The basaltic plateau that can be seen in the background has protected the sandstone that it covers from the erosion. At the center, beyond the mushroom, you can see some decorated Nabataean tombs, which make the fame of the site. I'm not going to talk about these tombs, but about tombs that haven't decorated facade. In 2020, I was asked by Leila Neme to take out the still pending issue of the date of a particular category of tombs from Hegra. These funerary chambers share some specific characteristics. Like I said, they don't have a decorated facade. They are dug several meters above the ground. Some have a cross-shaped plan due to extensions made on 3 of their walls, and some have their floor completely covered by pit graves. And finally, some are older than the tomb with a decorated facade. We will see which ones. For convenience, these chambers will be named high chambers. So, two cases of high chamber that have been partially destroyed when the stonecutters dug 2 Nabataean tombs exist. Here is the case of IGN 26 and 26.1. You can see here the ancient entrance of IGN 26.1, which have been integrated in the facade of IGN 26. On the section is highlighted the supposed original shape of 26.1. Actually, the stonecutters have destroyed the ground of 26.1 when they dug IGN 26, and thus formed a higher ceiling compared to the ceilings of the average Nabataean tombs. At this point, one can consider that most of the high chambers are earlier than most of the tombs with a decorated facade. 2 high chambers have been excavated at Hegra, but only one provided what can be considered as an absolute date. It's IGN 103. A radiocarbon date from bone collagen revealed that the burial of the tomb is dated to the interval 54 BC, AD 71. This date covers a period contemporary of the Nabataean decorated tomb edification, but also an earlier period, so it didn't validate or invalidate the possible anteriority of the high chambers. So, trying to tackle this date issue during the 2020 season of the Madain Sali Archaeological Project, I undertook a comparison of the cutting techniques used in the funerary chambers from Hegra with those used inside the tombs from the ancient Dadan. To achieve this, I made a systematic photogrammetric survey of the high chambers from both Hegra and Dadan. The ancient Dadan is located about 20 kilometers from the ancient Hegra, and their funerary chambers share some characteristics. However, the chamber of Dadan are dated from the Leonid period, as shown by the inscriptions in relation with. Here is a typical example of tomb with inscription. The funerary chambers from Dadan have been also named high chambers, as, like those from Hegra, they are all dug on the cliff overlooking the residential area. The comparison between the stone cutting techniques used in the tomb is useful if and only if there are identifiable differences between them, and if these differences can be explained by the tomb typology and or chronology. This is, of course, based on the assumption that tombs which have the same dates are more likely to have been cut using the same techniques, and vice versa. Thus, and ideally, a technique used only at Dadan may be considered pre-Nabataean, and a technique used only in the tombs with a decorated facade at Hegra may be considered Nabataean. In order to check whether this working hypothesis is correct, I first examined the stone cutting techniques used in the earliest dated Nabataean tombs from Hegra, that to be closest chronologically to the high chambers. The dates of the chosen tombs extend from the turn of the Christian era to the start of the 1st century AD. I also included unfinished tombs in my sample to evaluate the differences between finished and unfinished walls that is useful for comparison purposes. Finally, it seemed that IGN-26 and IGN-30, the two high chambers that have been destroyed when the stone cutter dug the Nabataean tombs, have to be included because they are ones which give a terminus postquem to IGN 26 and 30, 26.1 and 30.1. So a systematic photogrammetric survey of 23 tombs from Hegra and 15 from Dadan was undertaken. A skycard was laid on the floor as all the generated models were generated at scale. Here is an example of the photogrammetry. First observations were made on the spot. It seemed that the tombs didn't use the same cutting techniques. That was a good starting point. Indeed, some tombs were cut meticulously to make smooth and eye-catching walls, whereas some others seemed to be cut very irregularly, even left a row of digging. The unfinished tombs were unsurprisingly very different from the other tombs and been gathered in a special group, labeled later Group D. At this stage, I gathered few other tombs in a second group, the Group A. These tombs were cut in a very specific way. The surface of at least one wall received a complete post-extraction treatment with a peak in a very consistent manner. This group doesn't contain any tomb from Dadan. After this step, there were 28 tombs left unsorted. When I measured the average space between the traces of the tools visible on the walls, an interesting detail has been observed. So here are all the surveyed tombs, less the group A and the group D. As you can see, there is a lot of variation between less than 2 centimeters to more than 6.5 centimeters between the two marks. But more importantly, one of the biggest steps between measures coincides with a difference of type of funerary structure. Indeed, all the tombs under this step are high chambers, while the tombs above the step are decorated tombs. This difference is explainable as follows. In these high chambers, The walls are treated using various cutting techniques. The orientation of the marks varies randomly, and the tools, pick or point chisel, were used on very different surfaces, forming a sort of patchwork of techniques on the walls. Except the flatness of the walls, the stonecutter seems not to have paid attention on the global result coming from this technique. These characteristics make our group B. Since the orthophotographs showed here are the same scale, you can see how visible the difference between these two techniques is. In the decorated tomb, the walls are treated in a very raw manner or are not treated at all after extraction. Some tombs even show traces at the bottom of the walls of the trenches dug during block extraction. This is our group C. We finally got 4 groups A to D. Here are the groups concerning only the finished tombs. So this is the final sorting of the examined tombs. Confronting this typology to the catalogue of the tombs of Hegra published in 2015, I discovered that one Nabataean tomb, IGN24, has been cut using the technique of Group A. This is why it's present in this table. Luckily, Group A, B, C have each at least one tomb with date information. Of course, the Dadan tombs, part of the Group B, date to the Leonid period that ends in the second half of the 1st century BC. In the Group B, there is IGN 103, a date to between mid-1st century BC and 71 AD. In Group A, there is IGN 24, which I talked earlier, and which is a decorated tomb, and date to AD 35 or 36. Finally, in the Group C, there are 4 dated tombs. They cover a period between the turn of the Christian era and the second half of the 1st century AD. So, Group B seems to be the oldest one, with pre-Nabataean tombs and one tomb by GN 103 date to between the mid-1st century BC and the end of the 1st century AD. Group C seems to be more recent, from the turn of the Christian era to the mid-1st century AD. Group A has probably coexisted with Group C. If one considers that all the tombs from Dadan, which are pre-Nabataean, belong to Group B, and since the majority of the tombs cut high on the cliffs at Hegra also belong to Group B, including IGN 103, it is possible to suggest that at least some of the Hegra tombs of Group B are either pre-Nabataean or early Nabataean, up to the turn of the Christian era. There is no way one can be more precise for the moment, especially since the main characteristic of Group B is precisely that it is made of a combination of techniques applied randomly on the walls, and it may therefore have been used at different periods. Some further results. Different characteristics of the high chambers have also been confronted between themselves. What is the repartition of the groups between the necropolises of both sites? At Dadan, all the tombs are part of Group B. We will see a characteristic other than the cutting groups that shows a significant repartition. At Hegra, however, the groups are unevenly allocated in the necropolises. These latter coincide with the different outcrops of the sites, and as you can see, Group B is twice only present group among the high chamber in the necropolis. If we consider the chronology that have been suggested before, it is thus possible that the oldest high chambers were cut at Jabal al-Marchar and at the unnamed outcrop with IGN 103 to 108. Concerning Dadan, inside the high chamber of Dadan, there are different kinds of inner funerary structures. But among the 15 chambers surveyed, there are only 4 chambers that don't have inside them burial niches or the engraved shape of a burial niche. And interestingly, these tombs are grouped on the same cliff along a 30-meter long area. 2 chambers among this little group have unparalleled funerary structure in Dadan. DO3 has lateral extensions, and therefore as a secondary chamber. This group is specific in many ways and should deserve a further study. Finally, even if it's still difficult to date the high chamber on the chambers on the basis of the present study, and even if the inner structures of the high chambers are different between Hegra and Dadan, one can suggest that group B is characteristic of high chambers both in Hegra and Dadan, and that the ones from Hegra are likely to be earlier than the turn of the Christian era. During the future season of the Dadan archaeological project, the further study of the necropolis will be undertaken. So thank you everybody for your attention.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's really interesting. It's lovely to see some more sites, and in particular to see your excellent photographs of the tool marks on the walls. It's really good examples of photography. I'm just going to sneak one question in before we move on to our next paper. So you also have been using 3D photogrammetry, taking photographs and presumably doing work in Agisoft to put them together. Yes. So, of course, I wondered, are you able to comment on the advantages as you see them of making the three-dimensional models using photogrammetry? What are the main things that gives us?
In my case, I use it very in a principal way to make measurements on the wall directly, making orthophotographs. It is also I think a quick way to make a plan of the tombs, quick sections, and also I think a further use will be maybe making some vertical GIS. I think it could be an interesting way to make more statistics on the tool marks.
Great, thank you. It's really interesting to see that metrical use, because so often these 3D models are used for presentation or for communication to show to people, but it's great to see that technical use. Thank you, Paul. I'm sure there'll be more questions later on. So we're going to move on to our second paper this afternoon, which is given by Christopher LYES from the School of Archaeology at the University of Oxford. His paper is entitled Theorising Ancient Quarries, How Far Have We Come? So Christopher, over to you.
So I think, can you hear me and can you see me?
Yes, we can hear you, we can see you. And so when you're ready, if you can share your screen. Perfect. That's great. Thank you.
Right, well, good afternoon, everyone. And before I start, I'd like to say what a terrific conference it's been and to congratulate the organisers. I've really enjoyed hearing all of the contributions, and it's refreshing to see some new approaches being taken. I've chosen to start my talk with this quote from Homi K. Barber's book, The Location of Culture. There is, he argues, a damaging and self-defeating assumption that theory is necessarily the elite language of the socially and culturally privileged. The Olympian realms of what is mistakenly labeled pure theory are assumed to be eternally insulated from the historical tragedies and the wretched of the earth. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that Barber is here talking about the use of stone in antiquity, nor even about archaeology. He is, of course, talking about post-colonialism, but I think the underlying point is still relevant, that there is a divide between those who practice in the field and those who work primarily with theory. And for the next few minutes, what I'd like to do is to take a little time to look back at the development of studies around quarrying and the broader use of stone in antiquity to add a little weight to this thought. Taking a leaf from one or two of this conference's speakers, I'll then think for a moment about areas where more theoretical applications ought to be deployed to move our debates forward, arguing the case for three approaches which might pay dividends, before finally bringing things back to earth with a few thoughts around the dangers of not integrating the theoretical with the practical and the risks we run if we only focus on one or the other. Prior to this conference, I think there's been a certain set of traditional approaches that have come to dominate our field. We might set at the heart of this the pioneering work done by John Bryan Ward Perkins at the British School at Rome. And it's important to note that Ward Perkins' approach to his studies came with a certain mindset. He was, after all, a military man, a scion of the British Raj, and in consequence, a man with a particular focus on logistics and the nuts and bolts of archaeology. His shadow still looms large over the field today, more so than I think many scholars, myself included, would like to admit. And those approaches were entirely appropriate for the time. The problem now is that, perhaps because of this, the sort of theoretical debates that have influenced so much of wider archaeological thought over the last 3 or 4 decades have failed to gain a foothold in our field. Instead, research has focused on a restricted number of traditional themes. There's been, for example, an excessive focus on decorative stone, marble, granites, and porphyries, rather than the more common building stones such as tufa and poros, and an overwhelming focus, at least in the classical world, on the supply of goods to the city of Rome. This has been challenged recently, but the influence of a Rome-centric perspective continues to permeate the field, including my own work, so it's been a delight to see such a diversity of sites being discussed here this week. But I'd also argue that we've seen in the historical pattern of scholarship an under-theorized exploration of trade, one that's tended to focus on logistics and has developed into a sort of an unbalanced approach to supply and demand, concentrating heavily on the means of production and transport and very little on the nature of consumption. Indeed, I'm not even sure we know what consumption means in our context. And whilst we may focus on identifying transitions from one product, technique, or style to another, rarely do we prioritize why these changes happened. What were the agentic forces that drove these shifts? But even within the existing praxis, there are gaps. There's been very little developed understanding, for example, of the impact of local extraction of these materials and how that might interlace with global trade. There's been little engagement with other forms of theoretical debate too. The material turn, for example, has pretty much failed to have any impact on the broader field of stone studies whatsoever. The dominant theme, though, is one of archaeometry. Research over the last 30 years has become heavily data-driven, and what bothers me is the seeming obsession with the compilation of ever greater data sets of scientific results, mostly in respect of provenance studies, but increasingly within the newish field of econometrics. Results that frequently fail to provide or integrate with broader archaeological, anthropological, or historical contexts, instead focusing on quantitative analysis and increasing levels of precision and complexity. The simple truth is that neither science nor archaeology occurs by focusing on accuracy simply to stockpile geochemical measurements and somehow expecting knowledge to emerge out of the numbers. This pattern of academic conservatism reveals itself in this chart, which presents a simplified thematic analysis of the relative proportions of papers falling into each of the principal themes of the Asmosia congresses. We can see just how numerous these data-dominant studies have become. If, and it's a big if, it can be assumed that Asmosia is representative of the wider picture of scholarly endeavour, then this implies that efforts around provenance studies and the improvement of scientific techniques, the grey tones, continue to account for at least a third of the research base. Aspects of trade and economy, in contrast, seem to have fallen by the wayside, and this is strange, for there have been major initiatives in this area outside of Asmosia, most notably the Oxford project at the University of Oxford, out of which sprang both Ben and Fred's books. These studies address themselves to understanding the nature of production and the administration, distribution, and chronology of quarrying, each taking a step aside from those heavily scientific approaches in order to create a more nuanced reading. However, other than this, very few works in our field produce much in the way of theoretical discourse, though, as we've seen with Claudia's paper this morning, theory is hugely relevant. There we had a clear application of a theoretical perspective to real-world data, setting out an exciting new direction for interpreting quarry marks and quarrying. This aspect of cognitive archaeology is an approach we're heavily invested in here at Oxford, where we have the theoretical archaeology lab led by the originator of material engagement theory, Lambros Malafouris. Indeed, just prior to us receiving the programme for this week's conference, my colleague Emanuele Prezioso and I started to think about addressing precisely this topic, applying MET to tool marks. hence the lovely picture in the Book of Abstracts. We didn't know that Claudia had already beaten us to it. So reluctantly, instead of thinking about cognitive archaeology, I'm going to turn to a few other areas of theory that I think could well have application to our studies. The first of these is economic theory. However, before processing too far down this road, we must firstly introduce the caveat that both underlies and potentially undermines all such work in this vein. For how far does economic theory offer an appropriate instrument to the study of the ancient world? For to apply such a theory is also to test it against the evidence, potentially in ways which have not previously been attempted. Questions then of consumption versus production, global versus local, and indeed how precisely can we model this kind of economic activity over the longue durée? But these questions have to be situated within a theoretical framework. Leo Long at Aphrodisias has already made some explorations down this route for the local Aphrodisian marble quarries, but I sense there's more that can be offered. So how can we approach this element of the economy of ancient stone? Well, the concept of division of labour has already permeated much of the work on the logistics of stone extraction. But perhaps theories such as Adam Smith's notion of the invisible hand might also be a useful consideration in understanding, for example, the processes of commissioning. We might perhaps perceive this invisible hand in Pliny the Younger's letter to his architect Mustius. I am told by the soothsayers, he says, that I must rebuild the temple of Ceres, which stands on my property. It needs enlarging and improving, for it's certainly very old and too small, considering how crowded it is on its special anniversary, when great crowds gather there from the whole district on the 13th of September, and many ceremonies are performed and vows made and discharged. But there's no shelter nearby from rain or sun, so I think it would be an act of generosity and piety alike to build as fine a temple as I can, and add porticos, the temple for the goddess and the porticos for the public. Will you then please buy me 4 marble columns, any kind you think suitable, and marble for improving the floor and walls? Similarly, I think there's potential for the application of specific approaches like prospect theory, particularly in respect of diminishing marginal utility and disutility, or perhaps the production possibilities frontier, an aspect of microeconomics that could be fruitfully applied to better understand the trade-offs in reallocating resources from one sphere of production to another. Here, the core tenets of supply and demand can, I argue, be applied, but only if we, as archaeologists, can develop a better comprehension of what actually constituted demand in the ancient world. We might too explore whether those making purchasing decisions, like Pliny and Mustius here, ever actually had enough information to make fully informed decisions. So perhaps we might invoke Akerlof's asymmetric information theory, which describes precisely this situation, where one party knows more about the goods they're negotiating over than the other. Presumably a reasonable reflection of commercial life in a world where unequal trade deals would have been common. Might this then lead us down the route of questioning how fully informed stone purchasing decisions really were, and even illuminate the thorny issue of production to stock versus production to order? The extent of the potential for theoretical approaches to make a mark is not, though, constrained just to the field of economics. Broader archaeological, ethnographic, and sociological theory needs to be applied too. And in this vein, the ethnographic work of Paraskevas Potiropoulos is significant, work that resulted from the workshop on craftspeople mobility that was held at the British School at Athens 2 years ago. The suggestion being that masons were primarily village-based, with close connections between stonecutters and builders. But we also need to be receptive to approaches that travel in the opposite direction. Multiscalar analysis, for example, a technique frequently applied to quantitative data, has, I believe, considerable potential to operate at a higher epistemological level. But most of all, I think there's still considerable potential left to introduce concepts around materiality and agency. These, as I mentioned earlier, have not seen a particularly strong take-up in stone studies, where I would suggest that a structuralist mindset has prevailed, one that has obscured the role of the individual by emphasizing systemic and societal rules of meaning. For an activity that was second in importance only to agriculture, the role of human actors in these systems, whether as groups or as individuals, has been surprisingly absent from our studies. Who, for example, held power in these actions and transactions? Is it just those who already had power invested in them? And who is it that's missing from the archaeological record? How constrained by structural elements was their own agentic behavior? In this respect, might we think perhaps of the prison camp in the Giallo-Antico quarries? But this kind of archaeological evidence is rare, so how can we critically engage with these elements of inequality? I think it's a reasonable charge that archaeology, in this theatre at least, has fallen into a sort of systems and object fetishism. And to get out of that, we should reintroduce a relational humanism, one that acknowledges the social and material constitution of agency without surrendering any of our analytical coherence. And then the rather vexing question of non-human agency. Agency carries a sort of ontological belief that non-human entities have power in society. But there remains the question of whether agency is a distinctively human characteristic at all. Nevertheless, the materiality of stone clearly did influence its affordances. Extraction, transport, and utility are all a factor not just of the agency that humans gave the material, but also of the material's own innate obduracy. So there are multiple potentialities for us to instantiate theoretical approaches into the practical sphere. Indeed, we must, for there's a real danger if we do not, a danger of slipping into an opposition between theory and practice, one that echoes what the sociologist Charles Mills describes as a distinction between grand theory and abstract empiricism, where the first ignores real-world problems in favor of abstract theoretical models, and the second focuses exclusively on method and data. Approaches that can lead to the limited study of small-scale questions that remain isolated from the larger context. So to sum up, and to restate my elevator pitch, it seems to me that historically, the field of stone studies has been damaged by the lack of an epistemologically aware approach to historical inquiry, an approach that moves beyond the recording of data and provenance towards a more integrated response to the evidence. Michael Smith has suggested that an awareness of just such an epistemological model is needed throughout archaeology to raise its argumentation to the levels of its siblings in the social sciences. He argues that there's a need for middle-range theories that can be operationalized and tested. But to begin with, I think we need to get back to basics and address the issue that my colleague Mark Pollard identified some years ago with respect to general archaeological science. What are the most important questions that we need to resolve in the next 5 years? Earlier this year, I planned to do just that with a session at the annual meeting of the American Institute of Archaeology, where the plain and simple question was to be, what are the big questions for the study of stone in antiquity? However, a little thing called COVID-19 got in the way and we had to cancel, but maybe there's still a broader need to address this, to move, just as we have this week, the debate forward, and perhaps one day develop a comprehensive statement of the research aims of this field. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. That I think you've made an extremely succinct but thorough statement of the position, and I think it's wonderful to have that contribution. If I may, I just want to ask one question before we move on to our final paper, which I think to an extent you have answered, but. So, do you feel that the theory gap that you paint is particularly egregious in classical archaeology, if I've understood you correctly, or in stone studies more generally? Are there some areas, perhaps period-based, that are ahead of the game, and others that have got so much catching up to do? Or do you see it as a sort of topic rather than period-based thing?
Well, let me tell you a story. I gave more or less the same talk at the European Association of Archaeologists about 6 months ago, I think it was. And they put me in the wrong slot. At least I thought it was the wrong slot to begin with, because it was, what was the topic? It was a research agenda in stone studies. So they put me in with the lithics people, the prehistorians, the flint knappers and all those. And I thought at first that was going to be horrendous. But in actual fact, it was amazing, because it was clear to me that they were so much further ahead in things like cognitive archaeology and things like thinking through the thought processes that went on when someone was knapping flint. So you know, the lithics people are quite a long way ahead of where we are in what I would call stone studies, just because I can't think of a better term. We need to think of a better term for it. So I think there is a degree of we are a little bit behind the times. Now, the question of whether it's a problem throughout classical archaeology, I've got to be honest, the view from Oxford is slightly different from the view from elsewhere, because we are a theoretically based institute, and so we concentrate heavily on theory, although there's a certain amount of practice as well. And I would say no, there's not. I think classical archaeology, there are developments around theoretical the application of theoretical approaches, but it's not as strong as it is in other areas of archaeology. You know, somebody mentioned earlier Chris Gosden's, I think it was Claudia, Chris Gosden's work, Tim Ingold's work. You know, those guys are, again, prehistorians. They're moving things forward rapidly.
Yes.
My own colleague Emanuele, I mean, he works heavily on material engagement theory, cognitive archaeology, in an archaeological perspective. So I think if I had to rank it, I would say general archaeology is doing quite well. Classical archaeology is in between, and then stone studies is way behind lithics.
Thank you. Yes. Well, these are very much the thoughts I've been having over the course of the past couple of years as I've been doing some work on post-medieval sites here in the UK, and trying to do a range of reading. And Raphael Samuel's work in Oxfordshire, in Kidlington, the Kidlington Quarries, interviewing quarrymen who were still working in the mid-20th century while the quarries were still open, looking at the social approach that he took, and that the knowledge from below, the idea that you would do the ethnographic work, you would interview the people working in the quarries, and this is how you would understand the sites, is quite influential. But from an archaeological perspective, is still quite a traditional industrial archaeology, where again the application of theory is somewhat limited, shall we say. It's quite a traditional, takes a traditional approach. So it's really interesting to think about these parts of our discipline and the progress that they're making, or the changes that they're making. That's great. I'm going to move on to our third paper, and we'll come back to this in the discussion, and I'm sure Claudia will have quite a lot to ask and say as well. This is where we would really love to be able to go to a cafe and have a beer and have a chat, isn't it? But we'll do our best. Thank you. So let me just get myself reset. We're going to move on to our third and final paper of this afternoon session. Thank you, Chris, for joining us. We'll hear from you again later in the questions, but we're going to move on now to a paper authored by Matteo Zagarola and LETIZIA Tessicini. LETIZIA, we're very pleased to see you here this afternoon. Thank you for joining us. They're from the Università degli Studi dell'Itascia. Their paper is titled "The Evolution of Negative Architectures, Two Cases from Orte," which is an area in Italy. So Letizia, if you would do the technical things of sharing your screen.
Of course.
You can take your time to do that. There we go.
Okay.
Thank you. Over to you.
Okay, so good evening, everybody. Thank you for this opportunity to present our two cases. The presentation will be about two relatively new sites, because they are actually always been known by the people in Orte, but this is a preliminary report, because the study of these two quarries is just at its start.
Thank you. Letizia, could you just reshare your screen again?
Yeah, we lost it. Sorry, I think you interrupted it.
Oh, yes. Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Don't you worry.
So this. Okay. Ah, yes. Because well, my mistake. Sorry. Instead of hiding, I blocked it. Sorry. So I was just saying that this is a preliminary report about these two sites that are in Orte, which is in the central part of Italy, just north of Rome, near the Viterbo, which is in the Tuscia area. And the territory, which are Orte is in, is characterized by two kind of geological features. The main one, as you can see, is the yellow one, which is limestone. And the second one is tuffo, which is the main rock of the Tuscia area. So almost all the towns are built around this kind of features. In Orte, you can see there are two main hills or cliffs made of tuffo, which is Orte, the historical center, and San Bernardino, which is the hill in front of the historical center. And these are the two locations of the quarries. This is the an overlook of the cliffs, so you can see how it is the city. And this is the plant of the area. This is the historical center of Orte, and as you can see, the tuffo is a soft stone, so it's really easy to excavate. So during the whole duration of the history of this town, the underground was exploited for different kind of uses. The main one is the water system, you can see in blue and green. Then there is the wider, which is the storage, which covers for many levels the whole extension of the hill. And then there are the peculiar ones, which are the dovecotes. You can see the pigeons here, which are the pigeon farming. It's quite typical of this area. And this is the peculiar interest of this, the first case, which is the La Rocca quarry, which is located here. I don't know if you can see the pointer, but this is the area where the quarry is located. And here you can see on the map. And as you can see, we circle the dovecote E. And this is the La Rocca quarry. We call it La Rocca because this quarry is just under the area where originally the castle in Orte was located, La Rocca, so in Italian. And in this place where the quarry is found, we have a dovecote that was the former use of this underground. So the quarry is not a new element in the underground, but it is something that starts destroying a pre-existent hypogeum, which was used for production of pigeon meat. So to simplify the use of dovecotes, it's just this. It was something that was really important for the town. So having it to be functionalized for a quarry is quite important and relates probably with what was happening in the upper level. The quarry destroys two domes of dovecotes. So here you can see the section, the wall that was completely destroyed, but you can still see the holes of the dovecotes on this section. And this is another example of the wall of the dovecote that was cut to have the quarry, which is in two levels. The first level is the dovecote floor, and the second one is what I'm showing you now. And this other level doesn't use a pre-existent underground, so it's completely excavated from the new, starting from the floor of the dovecote. And then they go with these different tunnels that were started to be excavated, then enlarged and united. Only a pillar is left when the joint of the different tunnels is made. So this is the main feature that we can see in this quarry. The study of this place is difficult for us. It's new and is difficult to access because there is no direct way to arrive. We must enter it from the outside of the cliff. And the main difficulty is that there is no light. So the only light comes from a really narrow window, and all the study inside the second level mostly is in the dark. So we need to have a good light to make the leaf or all the study that we need. The second case is on the San Bernardino Hill, which is in front of the town of Orte, and is located in the area where in the 6th century before Christ, the Etruscan necropoli was situated. As you can see, we have two quarry fronts, signed with the arrows, and this quarry is interesting because the quarry front was started from Etruscan tombs. So starting from the existing hippogams, they started to excavate for production of tuffo. So they enlarged the existing tombs and started to excavate a new feature. As you can see from this image, this is the extension of the quarry. This quarry has got another level of difficulty because we cannot enter it because it's in a private property together with the Etruscan necropoli. And this year was particular, and we were not able to go inside because the property is not living in the house. So it's really hard to go and make new the leaf. Why I said that this is a preliminary report. This is because these two features have always been known. So we know about these quarries, but they have never been studied before, and they are only reported as negative elements. The quarry in the San Bernardino Hill is just reported when the necropolis is studied. And it's a negative feature because it destroys the Etruscan tombs. So no relevance has been given to these two features. Instead, we found it interesting because this is an element, the quarries, that arrive in Orte at the moment of its main development, which is the Middle Age. We propose this chronology for the quarries because of the how to say it? Sorry, I'm lost for words now. Because it is in connection with other structures that we can clearly date. So the dovecote is an element of the early Middle Age, and is really important for the town at this time to have a dovecote. So the defunctionalization of this is probably in late period of the Middle Age, while the San Bernardino quarry is in an Etruscan necropoli, and also in this case, the Middle Age is the only period where we can suggest that a quarry for tuffo can be developed into a necropolis. We can't think that this could happen in the Roman period. So probably it is in the Middle Ages. Also, the Middle Ages are probably the period where the city had a heavy need for construction material, and the city is completely built with tuffo. So this is the main moment where Orte had the need to build new building, churches, palaces. So the material had to be searched into the landscape. So the territory was limestone for the most part, and the only hills with tuffo and good tuffo to be used for construction is in these two quarries that we find here. Our interpretation of the use of the quarries is different. The quarry in La Rocca was probably used for tuffo on the first level, so starting from the dovecote. And the second level was probably used to extract pozzolana. We can propose this because the debris that are found on the floor, in this case, are composed of small black fragments of pozzolana. So probably this was the main extraction that was made in this site. And as you know, the pozzolana is a really important element to make concrete. So it's really important for the as construction material. While the quarry in the San Bernardino Hill was probably used to extract tuffo blocks for construction, because the tuffo is a little bit different, more compact, and probably is better for construction. And also because, as you can see, there is no black material on the floor. And also, if we can think that at some point they cleaned the floor, which is not likely because it's not a place where people go to clean for something. But this probably was because the tuffo was extracted here. We don't have any debris in this area, while we have a lot of debris inside the La Rocca quarry. So probably this can be an interpretation that can be given to these two features. So this is our work. It will continue as soon as we can enter physically again into these two chambers. We will start the study, but we wanted to present these two features, to give them light and to put the attention in a different underground, because the undergrounds in Orte have been widely studied. So there are publications, and it's also a touristic destination. But then the quarries have never been studied or put into light in this way. So this is our will for the future, is to study and publish these two quarries. So thank you for the opportunity that has been given to our team to present, and thank you for the attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to hear from another part of the country and its varied geology. I just wanted to ask one question before we go to the general discussion. And that is, do you know anything about the tools being used in the area to work the tufa? Are the same types of tools used to work the tufa and the limestone, or are they different? Do you have any information about that yet, or is it too early to say?
It's too early to say about the quarries, because we started to make the study at this time. But as what we know about all the undergrounds in Orte, also from direct reports of the most recent works that have been done in the undergrounds, they were yesterday there was a presentation about France Hypogean, and they showed the pickaxes. And they are really similar, but we don't have them. We were not lucky on this site, because no tool was ever found into these undergrounds. So we don't have any archaeological on this site. We don't know how they used it, but pickaxe and chisels were probably used for this work.
Yeah,
metal tools also. This is iron, because we are in the Middle Ages.
Thank you. So what I'd like to do is introduce or re-invite our speakers back in together. Thank you. So thanks. That's been a lovely set of contrasting papers for our final afternoon session. We're going to just move on to sort of questions and comments, and Claudia luckily is here to help me with that. And I have my notes here as well, which I've been frantically writing down. I've now got to try and read my own handwriting.
Go ahead if you have questions on your own while we wait questions to come in from YouTube, or
okay. So let me just get to the right bit of my notes.
Then I can ask one question if you want. While you
Well,
do
can you do that while I realise I've not organised myself very well just now.
You're perfectly organized, Kati. I wanted to ask a question to Paul. I have questions for you all, guys, obviously, but I want to start with a question to Paul. And I was wondering, I seem to remember that you said that the chambers are all carved in sandstone, right?
Yes.
And I was wondering if there is any variation in that sandstone or in the layers that could be associated somehow to the variation that you see in the use of tools.
It could be, but in fact no. At Hegra particularly, there is a lot of variations of quality of the sandstone. Today, some tombs are very destroyed by the erosion and the saline. I don't know how to say the penetration of salinity from the ground, and the group B, for example, could be used for poor quality of sandstone, but at Dadan the stone is very consistent, and it's only the technique of group B. So
okay, thank you.
Thank you.
That makes sense. Oh, Christopher has a question for Letizia. Then I let you ask it in person.
Letizia, I wanted to ask you, thank you for your talk, it was really good. I wanted to ask you about whether you had a sense about how widely used the tuffo from your quarry is. Does it get transported a long distance, or is it primarily a very, very local use?
It's local because the first quarry, the La Rocca quarry, is just under the historical center, so it's directly under the living place. So it's just to take it upstairs, so to say. So it's really close. And the other one, the San Bernardino quarry, is like 1-2 kilometers from the historical center. It's just in front of it. There is a small stream in the middle, and then this really close by. So it's just searching for the materials that you have in the landscape. No long transportation. It was just there. They didn't need to go and look. Also, I might had this. Also, the quarries for the construction that we have on the historical center, we only have 2 quarries that are known up to now, and they are not so big. The main explanation that we can give is that the undergrounds were so wide. They were always excavating. So the tuffo also came by the negative construction. So they extracted the tuffo for the construction directly from this work. So the quarries are important because it's an addiction, a need for more material.
I work on the tuffo quarries of Rome, which are enormous, and we see transport there of 20-30 kilometers to the end destination. So we're seeing the tuffo from those sites being transported quite a long distance. And I just wondered whether there was any similar situation where you are.
No, we think this is only local use. Okay. And when the need was finished, the use was stopped, or the use of the quarries probably stopped.
Does beg the question, what do we mean by local?
Sorry?
It begs the question, what do we mean by local? Because I would describe local as well. Yeah.
Yes. You know, in Italy we have many local. So town is the local. So the town next to us probably had its own tuffo quarries. It's so wide, so it's everywhere. So you don't need to go far.
Okay. we have like some questions coming in. So I see that Anais is suggesting to Paul is more like a comment. Yes, you know the work of Francesca Pere, and she says that he published a book about chronology and tools. That could be maybe a useful reference for your analysis.
Thank you. Didn't know.
Of course, and then there is a question from Katy to Letizia that you can probably say.
Yeah, no, I'll read that out. So yes, Letizia, I wondered, were other types of spaces cut out of the rock? So you mentioned the dove cuts, but were those spaces being used for other animals or for different storage, or what's the range that the town was using it for?
The range of the use of the underground in the town is really wide, and I probably didn't give much importance because I thought about the time, so I didn't dwell a lot on these aspects. But the use is really wide, and in the underground, in the historical center, so in the main hill, the use of the underground is in the Etruscan and Roman period. Is for storage as silo and cisterns, and for the collection of seepage water, and which is the main important use of the underground is for water, because on a Tufo hill there is no natural spring of water, so the collection is in the underground. And in the Roman period we have a real aqueduct, so the connection made by underground tunnels. And we keep with silo and cisterns and this kind of use. But it is in the Middle Age that they started to excavate completely the underground. You have to think that this hill is completely excavated in the underground. The uses for storage is for animal keeping. The side of the hill, the underground has got windows, so you can use it for production. So wine production, oil production, grain production, so leather production, and the dovecotes, which is a peculiar use of the underground, which is the pigeon farming. And we also have unicum, which is the Renaissance hypogeum in the underground. This is from the Renaissance period, which is a unicum. Also, we have a snow well for the storage of the snow. To have a refrigeration of food. So the necropolis, which is on San Bernardino, is another use. And the necropolis was turned in the Middle Ages into pens for animals. So also this use of the necropolis we can see. So it's the widest use of the underground that you can make. We have.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, we have some comments also coming in from YouTube, but I would like to ask a question. Okay, it's too late for me. I want to ask something to Chris, but we will do later. There is another question for Letizia. From Daniel, is destruction starting from Etruscan tombs certain? If I understand well, couldn't the quarry open from another part of the hillside have accidentally intersected the tombs?
This can be, but actually we have the front of the quarry is an Etruscan tomb, so this can be the case. But as you can see, they have the front of the necropolis and they start from there. So next to the quarry there are tombs that have not been touched, and next to there are other tombs. So the area was a necropolis, wide necropolis. So they knew where they were. So it's not. I know they probably started from another side of the hill and ended up in the necropolis. This could be possible, but they started from the necropolis. And so this is the case. They knew what they were doing when they started.
Thank you. Okay, so now I can go with my question for Chris. As Katy said, it would be lovely to just sit around the table and chat about this. theoretical questions that I think are extremely important and interesting. But there is one thing that you brought up that I think wasn't really brought up during these 2 days, and it's the relationship between archaeometry and theory and stone studies. I like it, stone studies. I think I want to be a stone scholar. But so I was wondering, you mentioned some very interesting works by Pollard and other people in FRAM, and it came to my mind that also Andrew Jones and Nicole Boivin have written like a lot of interesting stuff on the subject. So the question, I think, for me at least, was, can archaeometry used in a wise way help us dealing with the materiality of the stone somehow, or with these questions that are theoretical as well? How can we bridge it in a way?
Yeah, it's a difficult question, and that's very much the kind of discussion we had at the EAA conference back in August, I think it was. I think people do. I think that there are some really good studies that integrate, that certainly integrate the theoretical perspective. They're not quite as rooted in theory as perhaps people who are studying MET, and then some of my colleagues, 2 colleagues at Oxford who are studying MET and pottery in Crete, and so they're integrating actual ethnographic studies of potters in Crete with the theory, and looking at that from a primarily theoretical perspective. They're instantiating theory, but there are studies certainly in stone studies that do integrate archaeometry, practical studies, and theory quite well. And I'm thinking of Lynn Lancaster's work on the volcanic scoriae from southern Italy that's used in concrete in and around Rome, and thinking outside of stone studies, there's a work that was done on the oil lamps in Jerusalem. I'd have to double check the reference where I can find it. There was an archaeologist who looked at the oil lamps and then combined that with a sociological study to try and illuminate, if you'll excuse the pun, the sort of the sociological history of that city. So I think it can be done, but it's extremely difficult, because even if we come from a purely theoretical perspective, we're almost looking for evidence that will reinforce the theories. We're looking to instantiate that theory. I think what we need to do is to sort of integrate those two things much more carefully. And I think the first thing we need to do is to just try and understand what are the questions that we're trying to answer. I think there are lots of us, myself included, who are looking at practical. We're in the field, we're documenting quarries, we're looking at places of consumption, we're looking at where these stuff is used. What are the big questions that we're actually asking? And I don't think we know. And I think we have to start there.
Yes, interesting. Yeah, I'm looking if there is. Kathy, you also had a question for Chris. Maybe you wanted to ask.
That was another difficult one.
Well, it's one that I've been thinking about for a little while as well. Yes, thinking about contemporary ethnography, so working with people, present day stoneworkers. Are there what are the ethical? I'm saying are there? I think they are. Are there? What are the ethical considerations in interviews, in oral history, in working with stoneworkers, whether it's in the quarry or carving?
I'm not an expert on this, but I had some thoughts, and I think really they all focus around the word respect. There was this session that happened at the British School at Athens 2 years ago, which looked very good. I wasn't there, but from what I've seen, it sounded very good. I think there's the danger of perhaps objectifying people, objectifying those people who have worked in the quarries. I come from South Wales, and you do the same sort of thing with miners there. There's a risk of seeing them as repositories of information that can then help reinforce our studies. Well, they're not that, they're human beings. And so you have to get back to that sort of relational humanism that I was talking about, and not just see them as repositories of archaeological information. I did actually, Claudia mentioned the LETIZIA, the old, the marble workers who worked with the sleds getting the marble down the mountains. And I did meet one of them about 20 years ago, and I wish I'd probed him for a little bit more information, because he was absolutely fascinating. But I think, so the only thing that I can think of really quickly is we've got to have respect for people. We've got to treat people not as vehicles for information, but as human beings.
Thank you.
Okay. I was seeing that there was a question for Paul, still regarding your tool marks. It comes from Marie-Elise, but and also from me, because actually it's very interesting, and I was thinking about that too. But what about the spacing between tool marks? You use that as a sort of discrimination. No, how do you say it? Like, this was Italy English, but anyway, you use it to calculate the distance between tool marks, assuming that that is connected to some change in the gesture, and therefore you classify it as a specific technique. Did we understand correctly?
The average space between the tool marks is one of the characteristics of the group B and C. In group B, like I said, it's like a very sort of patchwork of techniques, and most importantly, there is a lot of absence of treatment in group C. In group C, you can see the traces of the trenches of block extraction at the bottom and the bottom of the walls, and in the group B, there is an attention paid on the smoothing the wall, but in a very hazardous, changing without further consideration. And the space between the tool marks helps me to make the difference between B and C, but it's not only this point.
Absolutely, thank you. And I think we have the time for one last question, Kathy.
Yes, just about. Yes, if we can.
Then there is one from YouTube, from Luke to Chris again. So if maybe Antonella can plot it, there it is. You suggest that the economy could add value. However, econometry relies on rather large data sets that are often missing. Could you elaborate on how econometry could help us?
I would actually say quite the opposite. My approach is that we need to be extremely cautious about econometrics for exactly that reason. I think I hesitate to call econometrics a sort of processualist approach, but what I mean is by that is that, as with so many of the processualist approaches, they tend to take ideas from other disciplines, but they don't take them wholly. So I think econometricians are taking some sense of statistical analysis, but they don't fully take it. So they don't sort of think about error. They don't think about variation. I'm being perhaps a little unfair here because I've only been to one conference on it. So. But I think the thing that I would say is I'm extremely wary about econometrics. I think potentially there's something there. There's some interest, but I get really nervous when I see archaeologists with huge, great spreadsheets and lots of numbers in, and then a single answer that says 42 at the end. That's sort of really worries me. So I think, Luke, I think maybe you misunderstood me slightly because I'm saying exactly what you're saying in your question. I agree with you entirely.
Okay.
Great, thank you. Well, that is the end of our discussion time. Thank you again to our speakers for this afternoon. There've been 3 contrasting and interesting presentations, and really that means that it's time to move on to our closing keynote of the day. So we're welcoming back Professor Francesca Sogliani, of the Università degli Studi della Basilicata to give that closing keynote. It's lovely to see you again from yesterday, Francesca. Thank you for joining us for our second day. So what I'll do is introduce Francesca and then we'll hear from her. She's Professor of Christian and Medieval Archaeology at the Department of European and Mediterranean Cultures of the University of Basilicata. And amongst many other responsibilities and positions that she holds, she is Vice Coordinator of the International Master's Course in Archaeology and History of Art and Director of the Postgraduate University School of Archaeological Heritage in Matera. Over the past 10 years, she has participated in the planning, the application, and the coordination of several European projects, amongst which the most recent is Project Delta, Digital Education Through Learning and Training in Archaeology. She currently directs numerous archaeological excavations of sites in Campania and Basilicata, and her current research deals with late antique and medieval settlements in southern Italy, rock and cave settlements, and the production and circulation of artifacts. Francesca will now speak to us about the DARHEM project, the Digital Atlas of Rupestrian Heritage of Matera. So Professor Sogliani, thank you again for joining us. And I will leave the floor to you.
Thank you. Thank you to be here again with you. I try to share my PowerPoint, if I remember. Share screen.
Yes.
Could you see it?
Yes, if you can, that's right. Start the presentation. It should load. We'll give it a moment.
Perfetto.
Thank you.
Okay. So I just want to say immediately that it's a very great responsibility after these 2 days of conference, so intense of quite 20 important contributions to pronounce a final keynote. And I really do my biggest compliments on the idea and on the realization of this conference, which I hope is the first of many. I would therefore like to introduce the theme of the rock settlement with some general notes and then explain how we came to build the project on this theme for the territory of Matera, starting from the history of the studies to arrive at the architecture of the Digital Atlas of Rupestrian Heritage. And I will help me with some evocative pictures of the town of Matera. Troglodyte sites are everywhere evidence of historical experiments set up for sustainable solutions, from those aimed at a simple survival to solutions offered by full development favorable to human occupation. There are testimonies of civilization and modes of settlement which make use of resources according to a way of life which is not quite under development, but rather a marvelous capacity to find a balance in often extreme situations in terms of resource availability, technology, and climatic conditions. The definition of excavated architecture or negative architecture, therefore, defines containment spaces that are obtained by the extracting material from an existing volume that result of an intentional action very similar to the built architecture in which the action is the expression of an additive act. And this methodology of stratigraphy, we are using it also for building addiction and excavated architecture. Concerning the approach to this subject, I would like to notice that in Italy, the studies of the Rupestrian heritage has so far taken into consideration many aspects, ranging from the framing of the geomorphological and geological peculiarities of the areas affected by this phenomenon, to the positioning of it in the evolution of the settlement phenomena from the prehistoric and protohistoric age, and then to follow up to the Middle Ages and more recent era, or even from the typological reading of the various rock agglomeration to the static architectural and technological consideration, without neglecting the historical artistic approach in the case of rock structures for liturgical use decorated with frescoes and painted walls, but much less frequently architectural decoration. An archaeological approach of the Rupestrian settlement was carried out only in these last 10 years research experiences, but this is what we turn our attention to, in the belief that the vast field of cave dwelling is actually a further and a fundamental piece of the anthropic landscape to be faced in its complexity and in its diachrony. One of the Mediterranean areas where the rock settlement appears strongly connotating and particularly articulated by chronological extension, functional aspects, and cultural significance is represented by the Matera area in the region of Basilicata, in antiquity and until the 12th century called Lucania. Here, the geological conformation of the rocky substrate made up of easily workable material called calcarenite, a sedimentary rock, has undoubtedly facilitated the architecture of subtraction, making it the most natural solution. The Sassi neighborhood, essentially most of the historic city of Matera, is probably one of the clearest cases of the persistence of cave dwelling practices until modern times. A series of research and efforts led to the admission of Matera to the list of UNESCO World Heritage Sites and subsequent rehabilitation in many areas since the forced abandonment in the 50s of the last century. I recall also the nomination of the town for the European capital in 2019. The Rupestrian settlement in Matera represented really the paradigm of the subtraction architecture, among which it is possible to observe a very particular stratigraphy of hypogeal voids built and spaces built above. In this way, the rocky shore is at the same time, in some period, the base for the construction and the reservoir for the supply of the raw material for the building. The settlement peculiarity represented by the Rupestrian heritage in Matera and the surrounding area, now well framed chronologically between the early Middle Ages and the late Middle Ages. And in this slide, I showed the medieval viability network connecting Matera to the internal area of the region, elaborating on the GIS platform with the data of the ancient itineraries, with the continuity of use that is typical of the various reuse up to the contemporary age, has been mainly studied as regards the spaces intended for worship until a few years ago, therefore churches and monastic complexes. This rich heritage has been the subject of studies since the end of the 19th century, initially exclusively concerning the historical and artistic aspect related to the painted elements that adorned the numerous Rupestrian churches in the town and in the peri-urban area. Here we see just some of the pictorial evidences of these beautiful churches, and some also architectural items of the liturgical spaces in these churches. We found some description of the rock churches in Matera, very high description, in the Descrizione della città di Matera, recently edited, written by Niccolò Domenico Nelli. We are at the end of the 18th century. The chapter 23 is dedicated to ancient parishes, which no longer existed at the time of Nelli. And he said these words, now they are either houses. So he testified the transformation of churches, of Rupestrian churches, in houses, cellars, where up to our times we can observe some effigies of saints painted on the wall, and most of them were dug out of tough rocks. I remember in these regards the pioneering works between the late 19th and early 20th century by Charles Dill, and the volume of Émile Berthaud dedicated to l'art dans l'Italie méridionale. But the Rupestrian churches of Matera will become one of the study topics of Eleonora Bracco, the new director of the Archaeological Museum Domenico Ridola of Matera, who settled in Matera in 1933. In 1940, the Bracco became a precursor of an archaeological approach to the theme of Rupestrian settlement and the relationship between structure for religious use, necropolis, and inhabited areas, anticipating lines of research that would be typical of medieval archaeology, in those years in Italy still to think. Bracco also took care to deal with the architectural and iconographic analysis of the Matera rock churches, both in the ancient urban center and of those distributed on the ravine, recording lists and having plans and relief drawn. In the 60s and in the 70s, other studies followed, mainly by art historians, among which I want to recall the dense contribution of Antonio Rizzi, collected in this volume, and then the following systematic cataloging made by the Circolo La Scaletta, published for the first time in 1966 and reissued in 1995. In the last decades, we have to remind also the contribution of Cosimo Damiano Fonseca for these territories, who have had the merit to identify in the concept of civiltà rupestre the centrality of the settlement phenomenon that I would define a complex as in general all the phenomena of urban and rural settlement are. Thanks to this interpretative line, the civiltà rupestre was no longer or not only an expression of monastic Rupestrian complex or Byzantine complex, or else it was no longer an expression of cultural subordination of marginality with respect to the organizational and social forms of the settlement, but stood as a container of a peculiar forms of urbanism inserted in a habitat and in a well-defined time scale, both and marked by all functional characteristics of the urban agglomeration. The most recent research in Italy we refer to are the ones we have some examples also in these days in Lazio, in Apulia, in Calabria, in Sicily, and of course in Basilicata, also in Molise, dealing with the analysis of the so-called negative architecture in a broader perspective to the different forms and function of the rock settlement, using the interpretative keys and the specific methodology of the global approach, the global archaeological approach, focused to a better definition of typologies and chronologies. In this perspective, under my direction, the research group of medieval archaeology and landscape archaeology of the Postgraduate School of Archaeology of the University of Basilicata has developed from 2008 some research projects aimed at understanding the settlement phenomenon in the Acroni, in Matera, and in its district. For the sake of brevity, I just list some of them. First of all, the archaeological map project of the town of Matera, which we had the collection of the archaeological data systematically organized with that testifies the phases of life of the city from the ancient time, from the prehistoric time into the late Middle Ages, to arrive at a definition of the archaeological potential of the urban stratigraphy. And among these places, obviously the area occupied was detected also for the Rupestrian sites. The map, secondly, the map of the geoarchaeological risk, which makes available important information regarding the criticalness of conservations and the value of the rock archaeological heritage, and at the same time constitutes the necessary preliminary approach for the realization of projects aimed at the restoration and enhancement of this heritage. Then the European project Bayerinet, Byzantine Heritage Network, enhancement of the Byzantine cultural heritage of Basilicata in partnership with Athens, Crete, and Cyprus. It was an Interreg Archimede program We finished in 2008, and on the frame of which we started the study of Rupestrian churches and Rupestrian itineraries all along the region. The fourth project was the program Galileo, an international project in the frame of the program of Italian-French University, entitled Application of New Investigation Technologies in Archaeology, GIS, 3D Modeling, Archaeometry, Case Studies related to urban and rural Rupestrian and fortified sites in southern Italy. I have divided this project with the equipe of the University of Rennes 2, with my colleague Dominique Aliosa. I think Claudia Sciutto could remember something about this project, because in that project we start to reflect on the technologies and tools and traces of excavating methodologies and empiric knowledge. And here there are the first results of that project, the first 3D modeling with the international partnership, of course. We try to document some churches, of course, and also to reflect on the volumes, on the levels, and on the possibilities that this kind of a documentation can give. In this perspective, the research project DARHEM, developed in the frame of the bigger project, CORA project, Archaeological Laboratories in Basilicata, which is a regional project I direct with a partnership, also international one, derives from the previous projects and move in the same direction. In this project, with the help of innovative methodologies of documentation and analysis, we affect the theme, the subject of Rupestrian and rock-cut settlement. In the frame of the project, we are focusing on different subjects. The main are the archaeological landscape study of Rupestrian settlement, including the network of viability, the exploitation of resources, the economy, the population diagram, the climate, and so on. Secondly, the analysis of plants and spaces distribution inside the rock-hewn complex through photogrammetric reconstruction, 3D modeling, and virtual reconstruction. Again, the study of different use and function of the rock-cut settlement in the diachrony. Liturgical use, dwelling, funerary. We have a lot of cemeteries, very well dated to the early Middle Age and Middle Age. Productive spaces and service spaces. The study, again, of the technology in carving spaces, which means empirical knowledge, tools, traces, the time to realize also the rock-cut spaces. Another item is the system of collection and the use of the water resources and of the shape that this system left in medieval Matera Rupestrian landscape. And more, the analysis and dating of the amazing repertoire of pictorial decoration, which in association or not with the sculpted decoration, helps to design the liturgical space of the rock churches. On this subject, we are applying archaeometric analysis, virtual restoration application, as you hear yesterday by Bruna Gargiulo, and integrated analysis, which means stratigraphical one, paleographical also, diagnostic for conservation, and more. And all the analysis also of the repertoire of architectural sculpted decoration. Another subject is the time and the dynamics of transformation of rock cut different part of the settlement, considering that a very big part of Rupestrian churches has been changed in destination, becoming quarries for the new architectural development of the late medieval town of Matera, mostly from the 14th century. Moreover, the diagnostic for conservation and protection of the Rupestrian heritage, and at the end, the highlighting and enjoyment of the Rupestrian heritage. If I can add some remarks, I can detail that in the Matera area and in general in similar geomorphological situations, the rock sites undergo settlement transformation in the diachrony that over time define more or less complex urban structures with articulated and multifunctional cave dwelling environments for animal production structures, places of worship, and cemeteries. I show here the results of some of the 3D reconstruction of Rupestrian churches. In these years, we cover quite all the Rupestrian settlement of the town. Analysis of plans and spaces distribution, reconstruction, 3D model, sections, measurable, this is very important for us, measurable sections to compare also the plans and to reflect on the time of realizing all the plan and the section of these churches. And of the utmost importance, as we see also in these days, is the study of the technology of carving spaces, which pass also through archaeological excavation. We have until now very few archaeological excavation in Rupestrian sites, also here in Matera. Here you see some pictures of the Church of San Falcione we have dug some years ago, and where we experimented methodologies with the equipe of Rennes. And in this example, we try to do analysis of traces, of tools, of traces, and to detect the layers in liturgical space. Also, this liturgical space has been transformed in quarries. As you see, the original plan of use of the church, and then down all the levels of the quarries. And here the system to study the traces of tools. But also the different use and transformation. Here, for example, in the outside part of the Church of San Falcione, we have the evidences for apiary, which has been a very big economy for the territory around in Matera during the late medieval period. I would like also to spend some words for the water system. We detect the system for regulating flowing waters. There are a lot of evidence, very, very big cisterns, public facilities for the storage of food also, and water. We have also evidences of all infrastructures, for example, roads, paths, terraces, and this physiognomy will constitute an evident topographical marker in the rock settlement of medieval and late medieval system. Here there are the collection of the evidence of cisterns in the site in the urban site and in the ravine. There is a very huge ravine here who divided the urban site to the Murgia territory. Different sites, also very frequent transformation of the rock with this channel to collect the rainwater in cistern here at the top, at the bottom. At the end, some words concerning the architectural decoration, very less studied until now. And I mean studied not only under the artistic and stylistic way, but by the production way. Crosses, pilasters, moldings, capitals, iconostasis elements represent the intention of the craftsman, stone cutters, to reproduce the internal ornamentation of churches in a bidimensional key, and constitutes the most significant evidence not only of the simulation and the imitation activity carried out by more or less specialized craftsmen, but also the trace of technological knowledge, of references to decorative models, of the use of specific tools. The study of this repertoire through a first catalogue of the evidences so far never carried out in the area is part of a broader analysis path concerning the cultural and the cultural influences reflected in the architectural decoration, the association of the apparatus and pictorial sculpted apparatus and pictorial in rock churches, the division of liturgical spaces of Byzantine and or Latin derivation, the theoretical and empirical skills and knowledge of stonecutters, craftsmen, the building side of Rupestrian churches, and the patronage. This systematic analysis has so far made possible to place the forms of the rock settlement of Matera in a defined segment of urban evolution that essentially corresponds to early medieval and medieval period, therefore between the 8th and 14th century. I am going to the conclusion. We are convinced that an archaeological, multi-scale and integrated analysis of the Rupestrian heritage still in progress on our part constitutes a privileged observation lens to reconstruct the historical settlement dynamics of the urban center and of the peri-urban center, and to deepen through methodological protocols and innovative techniques of analysis and documentation the physiognomy of the rock settlement of this part of southern Italy. Finally, the digital atlas of rock heritage of Matera will become, in our intention, a useful tool of promoting and disseminating the cultural heritage of Matera, as well as recent experience in creating virtual itineraries, as you see in these slides, dedicated to the rock heritage in the area. Here we experimented with the project 5G team, the same project we showed yesterday for the restoration, virtual restoration, the realization of some path of digital tourism and virtual reality to visit the Rupestrian churches on Matera with this kind of game, of course. But the visit tour is preparation to the tour, is the tour for people who are not permitted to join this difficult, sometimes part of the Rupestrian heritage, and to educate also to the patrimony, to the heritage of this kind of settlement. Some other pictures, and our project is still in progress. We ended some part of the project. Now we will launch a WebGIS concerning the Cora project, all the archaeological researches in the region of Basilicata, which can be interrogated in a WebGIS portal. And inside this, there are also our Rupestrian heritage. In Matera until now, that we have also some different parts of the region with less evidences, but very important also. We will affect it in next times, and we are trying to close also a publication concerning this research. Hope I will can share it with you as soon as possible, and I thank you for your attention, and I wait for you in 2023 in Matera. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Francesca. You've covered a number of years of research and project work there. You've obviously collected a large quantity of data as time has gone on and dealt with the technical side of that. Really interesting to hear you talk about the use of geographic information systems and think about the way that the information is used and then shared. Thank you so much. it's wonderful for me to see places like this, especially that I'm less familiar with. So a real treat for me. I think Claudia, are you going to take us through some questions if we have any?
Yes, I'm going to keep an eye on you if some questions come from the outside world. But meanwhile, I also would like to thank Francesca, and it was very interesting also to see in her presentation, as in other presentations as well, how actually the rock cut settlements and the quarries very often overlap, right? So that's also a good reason for keeping these two topics together, other than the technical methodological perspectives that we can have that are very similar, but because as Letizia also was showing in Orte, sometimes they insist on the same outcrops. So that was a really interesting point to make, I think. Yeah, but we can start if we have some questions among us ourselves. So if Marie-Lise and Anaïs also have questions, and then meanwhile we can keep a look on the YouTube chat.
I have a question for Francesca. Do you think that the stonemasons who carved the churches are the same who worked in quarries? Because you show us some part of the church which was also quarries. So I'm wondering if it's the same chronological use, and do you think that the quarries can be the stonemason who were the same?
No. I show the level, the yellow level in that church, which is one we documented. But the churches has mostly I think the 90% of the churches was in function as churches until the first part of 13th century. At the end of 13th century and from 14th century on, the town of Matera grew up, and this determined a very huge use of construction material. So from that date, the churches has been transformed and used as quarries. It is the reason why when we study the churches and when we enter in the churches, we have the perception that there is a very big and very high ceiling and very big spaces inside. But it is not true. It doesn't correspond to the original shape of the church, because the floor has been excavated and used as quarry. So the original floor of the churches is up, and we can imagine that there are completely different chronological period.
So it means that churches was disused at that time, during the medieval period.
Yes, disuse.
Okay.
The 90% of churches has been disused.
And do you know why? Have you some sources, testimony, written sources, which explain why a lot of...
Because they start to build churches in the town. They start to build churches, not more to excavate, not more to use the Rupestrian churches. They start with the entrance of the order, of the religious order, Franciscans and Dominicans orders. So they built the religious town, the medieval religious town, but built up, not excavated. And so they found the churches a very useful quarry, already shaped. So the only things to do is to take away blocks from the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting.
But I have a lot of things to say about quarries. I had no time, but for the lucky of Claudia, also we dug a cemetery inside the town behind the church. It was the cemetery of the church, and the cemetery was filling the quarry to build the church. We found when we dug the cemetery, when we move all the skeleton, the quarry, which some blocks still on site, just carved on the limits on the some sites, 4 sites, 3 or 4 sites, but left there on site, and the module, the dimension were the same of the dimension of the masonry of the church. So we have a lot of things concerning quarries also.
Okay.
That's fantastic. I need to come and see that.
Oh, yeah.
Visit.
Come back.
Yeah, exactly. Like sometimes I come back. We have also a question from YouTube, from Veronica Callas, who asks, thank you so much for presenting such a great work on Matera. So many similarities and differences with Cappadocia, of course. My question is whether there are rock-carved facades for churches or other spaces.
Very few. Because in mostly the well-preserved Rupestrian landscape is up on the ravine, but the ravine has been affected by a lot of crashes and avoiding of stones because of come si dice, static situation, very bad preserved, and so we lose the facades. The only things we have in the facades is not carved one, not just inside has been carved some churches, but the facade is very rough. Sometimes we have niches for the light. The only thing we see on the facades are the entrance, of course, sometimes with some well-defined entrance, but a lot of niches on the facade for the light.
Interesting. There was another question from Kati, actually.
Yes, I wondered, thinking about the town and the people living there today, and how parts of the Rupestrian sites were still occupied relatively recently until they were evacuated. And I wondered, how do people living in the town today relate to the sites that family members had to leave? Is there a personal relationship anymore? Are there memories, or do people ignore it? Is it just all for the tourists and the World Heritage? What is that relationship like today?
It's a fantastic question, Kati, and very important one. A lot of anthropologists, cultural anthropologists and ethnographists are reflecting on this because the problem is very articulated. The old people, when they moved from the Rupestrian settlement, which was until the 50 of the 19th century, the old people were placed in new houses with water, with light, with all the comforts. And for the first time, people told me that it was very strange for them to stay there. But after a while, they didn't want to remember no more the life in the Rupestrian houses.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't want to be back there. the old people, the ones who have moved from there. They don't want to remember, they don't want to be back. Only now the second generation use this heritage, and mostly now after the very important tourist occasion of Matera 2019, they transformed everything in, as I said yesterday, in bed and breakfast. So there is a transformation, and they lose completely the memory and the importance of this heritage. But we are fighting really for our archaeological map, for this kind of not conservation of the heritage. And also because it is UNESCO heritage, of course. We start to do an observatory for the Rupestrian landscape with the chair, the UNESCO chair we have at our university. And it is just a news from the last week that the municipality called us to restart with the project of the archaeological map, because they have a new urbanistic plan with new rules, and they wanted to accept our archaeological map inside. So maybe we can do something more for the preservation of this heritage. But for a lot of years, the Rupestrian town has been completely abandoned, not only by conservation projects, but also in the mind of the people. Now it's coming in a different way, but a lot of things have been destroyed, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. It is very interesting, the anthropological process as well. Like some people said that it went from, like, in less than 100 years, it went from being like the so-called shame of Italy, right, where people were really living in a poor situation, to being like the European capital of culture. So that is a huge transformation in such a little time. I like the idea of the bed and breakfast phase as part of the general chronological period that you can see on the entire city.
Yeah.
Yes. Do we have do you ladies have any other question? I think we are approaching the end. Well, if we don't have any other comments, we look forward to be following the developments of the archaeological maps and all this huge amount of work that you are doing in Matera. And thank you again for the presentation.
Thank you to you. Thank you to you. With compliments, really.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I think it's probably come to time to close our 2 days of conference. I want to thank, of course, all our presenters over the 2 days. We heard in the end 17 papers, and our keynote speakers each day for their presentations and for their insight. Of course, I need to mention our sponsors, including the Franco-Italian University, the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, the Lampeia Lab at the University of Marseille, the Università Autónoma in Madrid, the Excellence Cluster of the Department of Civilizations and Forms of Knowledge of the University of Pisa, where, of course, also we've had excellent technical support from Antonella Ficini and her colleague Francesca. Thank you so much. This would, of course, not have worked without your expertise and your time. We would like to thank the scientific committee who supported the conference: Marie Lauderat, Marie-Elise Gardel, Gabrielle Gattiglia, Marie Letizia Gualandi, who we heard from yesterday also, Maria Grazia Mellis, Dimitris Rubis, and of course, Professor Francesca Sogliani. Special thanks to our organizers, who are here on the screen in front of you, Claudia, Anais, and Marie-Elise, who've done such an amazing job and a lot of work putting this all together. Of course, we would love to have met with you in Pisa, but this online conference has been an amazing experience, and I myself have learned so much. I've really enjoyed hearing from everyone, discussing such interesting subjects. So we hope that you will be able to join the International Network for the Study of Quarries and Rock Cut Sites to keep the conversation going. So I hope everyone has a great weekend. And that you can enjoy some beautiful spring weather and get out some fresh air and exercise after our 2 days in front of our screens. But it has been wonderful. So I guess really it's just time to say goodbye.
And to thank you, Katie.
Thank you, Katie, for your
marvelous way, just 2 days.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Okay. Abraço. Bye bye. Thank you very much. Ciao.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Let's stay in contact. Let's stay in touch. Okay?
Sure.
Sure.